don't call my books romantasy. I call my books fantasy romance, and that is very intentional. It is partly because fantasyromance.com is my website, but it is mostly because I believe fantasy romance is the accurate term for what I write. My background is high fantasy, epic fantasy. Those are the books that made me fall in love with books. So growing up, I was reading Mistborn, Shadowmarch, Tyrants and Kings, The Chronicles of Prydain, The Lord of the Rings, The Inheritance Cycle, The Wheel of Time, and a whole bunch of Arthurian lore retellings. I love those books. You have such rich stories, rich cultures, rich worlds. I can't think of a way to describe the feeling of reading them other than magic. But I always kind of wanted to see something like those books I love so much, but with more emphasis on the romances, like Lan and Nynaeve, Vanson and Briony, or Faramir and Éowyn. I wanted to see the complex worlds, complex side characters, realistic politics, but with more romance. Grace Draven might do this better than anyone else I've ever read. She has these striking, gritty fantasy settings with these amazing love stories, and I kind of want to be her when I grow up. She can write fantasy really well, she can write romance really well, and she combines them beautifully. This may or may not be a hot take, but romantasy is much more closely related to the paranormal romance genre than it is to the high fantasy genre. Romantasy as a term is relatively new. It has sprung up mostly as a result of the success of A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, so that is the main book I'm going to be discussing here because it embodies all of the current romantasy genre expectations. A lot of people believe that A Court of Thorns and Roses was inspired by the Immortals After Dark series by Cressley Cole, which is a paranormal romance series. I don't know if Maas has ever read Cressley Cole, but I would agree that the Immortals After Dark series embodies a lot of the tropes, character types, relationship dynamics, and storytelling conventions that Maas also uses for her books. When I read ACOTAR, I saw a lot of influence from demon and vampire paranormal romance in particular. The biting, the batwings, the fated mates, the Lord of Darkness thing, the spicy uses of magic. From a craft standpoint, Maas took a paranormal romance story and put it in a setting of her own making. You can also see paranormal romance influences in Fourth Wing. The whole academy setting with a hot authority figure you're supposed to hate. Very much drawing on the legacy of paranormal romance books like Vampire Academy by Rochelle Mead. If you've read enough paranormal romance, you can really see that romantasy is very much inspired by it. There is nothing wrong with being inspired by something. For example, every modern fantasy author is inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. Even if a fantasy author has never themselves read J.R.R. Tolkien, they have been influenced by people who have been influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien. Even George R.R. Martin, who has a lot of problems with Tolkien and writes stories that are intentionally opposite to the style of The Lord of the Rings, is still inspired by Tolkien. He's just inspired in a negative way. It is okay to be inspired by something. There's this phrase, steal like an artist, which I personally don't like just because I think it oversimplifies things. However, art creates culture. Culture creates art. All art is in conversation with art that came before it. So I would not say Sarah J. Maas is inspired by Cressley Cole, but I would say Sarah J. Maas is definitely inspired by paranormal romance, of which Cressley Cole is a major player. I have no clue what Maas has and has not read. I don't know her. Romantasy is the sibling, if not the twin, of paranormal romance. The only consistent difference between them is that paranormal romance is set in the real world, our world, with supernatural elements, whereas romantasy is set in a made-up setting. Otherwise, paranormal romance and romantasy share most, if not all, the same genre tropes and conventions. The major difference between high fantasy, epic fantasy, and romantasy is the world building and the side character development. I'm going to preface this by saying this is by no means unique to romantasy. I read a lot of historical romance and contemporary romance that does this too. It's just a romance thing. But in romantasy and other romance genres, you very often see this thing where the world and the side characters are only developed in as far as it is relevant to the main love story. The notable exception to this is usually other characters who will end up being main characters in later books. Sometimes they get character development, but it is rare that other characters who will not be future main characters do. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. Quite honestly, that is often exactly what romance readers want. Romance readers want the romance. So a lot of authors focus on the two main characters and their relationship, and don't worry about much else beyond how it directly affects the two main characters. Right after my childhood dog died in January, I felt awful. I wanted a distraction from crying on the floor, something that wouldn't make me think too hard. So I binged the Immortals After Dark series. It was effective, and it was exactly what I was looking for at that time. A lot of romance readers are looking for that, especially if they are under a lot of stress or just going through it. A lot of us read romance to escape. That is something you will hear very often. I get it. So the fact that in Romantasy, the side characters in the world building are secondary or tertiary should not be seen as a bad thing. It's just a thing that for some people is good and for some people is not what they are looking for. I know that high fantasy and epic fantasy are also not for everyone. I understand that, and it is okay. But because I come from a high fantasy, epic fantasy background, I really love doing research to build out worlds and breathe life into them. I interviewed Harald Hardrada's biographer about Viking warfare. I once had a friend introduce me to a geologist so I could ask them questions about my desert planet and warlords of the Sand Sea. I emailed a Cambridge professor with my questions about early medieval sheep and got a response. I love nerding out when it comes to make-believe. I also really love developing side characters. If you've ever read like the doorstop fantasy novels with like 28 POV characters, you know what I'm talking about. I try to limit myself to 2 POV characters at a time, but you know where I'm coming from. I am deeply fascinated by people and what makes them tick. I have a rule that I never write a character unless I can feel compassion for them. So because I feel compassion for all of my characters, it's easier for me to give them agency and development within the story. Some characters get less page time than others, that's just how it is. But I do try to think about my side characters as a fantasy author, just as I think about my worlds as a fantasy author, if that makes sense. I also love romance. I love love, and I love having that at the heart of the story. My books end up being about 50% high fantasy nerd out and 50% romance. So I call my books fantasy romance because that is what best describes them. I want to set up proper reader expectations with my books. They were written by a nerd, and sometimes it shows. A romantic nerd, but a nerd. My books are not for everyone, but they are for some people, and I want to help those people find them. So that is why I always say I write fantasy romance. I do not write romantasy.